Hey guys, tonight we're diving headfirst into a world where beauty wasn't just painful, it was downright terrifying. Picture this. It's the Middle Ages, and if you want to be considered beautiful, you basically have to look half dead. Think ghostly pale skin, sunken cheeks, and eyes so shadowed they might as well be bruises. You probably won't survive this, but don't worry, it's just a bedtime story. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know what time it is and where you're watching from. Always love seeing who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're in a cold stone chamber, lit dimly by flickering candlelight. The air smells like beeswax and old wool. You sit before a warped bronze mirror, trying to perfect your look. Only, what exactly is perfect in the 14th century? First off, if your skin has even a hint of colour, you're already behind. Pale skin wasn't just a preference, it was mandatory. It screamed wealth. If you were tanned, it meant you worked outdoors like a peasant. Gross. But being pale wasn't enough. You needed translucent skin, with visible blue veins running along your forehead and chest. That sickly, almost cadaverous appearance. That was peak hot. So how did people pull this off? Mostly through a horrific combination of bloodletting and staying inside like a medieval vampire. You might smear on a thick paste of vinegar, crushed pearls, and lead to bleach your complexion. Yep, actual lead. It burned, corroded your skin, and eventually poisoned your bloodstream, but hey, you looked aristocratic doing it. One historical example that stands out is Queen Elizabeth of York. Portraits of her show an impossibly pale face, hollow cheeks, and dark eyes framed by a high forehead. All textbook beautiful at the time, but scholars argue whether these depictions were real or just artistic wish fulfillment. Maybe she looked like that, maybe she didn't. What we do know is that looking like death warmed over was a whole aesthetic, and women leaned hard into it. Now imagine trying to achieve that signature sunken cheek look. In a time before contouring kits, you'd resort to actual starvation. Wealthy women were known to limit their food not only to stay thin, but to maintain that slightly hollow, ethereal face shape. Some would even suck on lemons or rub them on their skin, hoping the acid would drain some of the plumpness from their cheeks. Sounds made up, right? Nope. That's a real medieval tip passed from lady to lady. Let's not forget the role of the artist. Medieval painters weren't exactly going for realism. The faces they painted were filtered through layers of religious expectation and class-based fantasy. Smooth, deathly skin. That wasn't just beautiful, it was holy. A pure soul had to live in a pure body, and that meant no flaws, no colour, no warmth. If you were lucky, the local painter would throw in some gold leaf to brighten up your halo. Otherwise, you were stuck looking like a very fashionable ghost. But here's the strange, almost comedic twist. While noble women were desperately trying to look pale and frail, peasant women were actually, alive. They had sun-kissed skin from working the fields, muscular arms from hauling water, and rosy cheeks from real oxygen. To the elite, this was horrifying. To us, honestly kind of refreshing. Still, the divide was serious business. If a noble woman got too much sun and her skin darkened, it could actually be scandalous. She might lose status, or worse, be assumed to be slipping morally. That's how tightly beauty and virtue were knotted together. Your face didn't just speak for you, it shouted your whole identity, and if it didn't conform to the cold, pale standard, society made sure you knew it. Now here's a quirky little tidbit. There was a trend, especially in northern Italy, of using leeches for both medical and beauty reasons. Want to get rid of a pimple or lighten your skin a few shades? Slap a few leeches on your face and let them do their thing. People genuinely believed the blood they sucked out would carry away impurities. Scientific? Not even close. Painful? Absolutely. Effective? Debatable. And speaking of debates, there's an ongoing scholarly discussion around whether this whole beauty ideal was enforced more through actual fashion practices or through literature and art. Some historians argue that most women never really adopted these looks fully. It was more aspirational than literal. Others suggest that many upper-class women, especially in court, took these standards very seriously and actually altered their bodies and routines to meet them. Which side is right? We may never know. Diaries from that time are rare, and beauty wasn't something people wrote about candidly. It was just expected. But that's the thing. The brutality of these standards wasn't in the actual lead creams or the starvation tactics. It was in the silence. There was no escape, no do you girl movement. If you didn't conform, you weren't just unfashionable, you were suspect. Maybe sinful, maybe diseased, maybe both. So you stare at your reflection in that blurry mirror. Your skin stings from the vinegar, your cheeks ache from being hollowed by fasting, the candle flickers and you catch your face from a differy. Let's not forget the eyebrows. They had to go too. Women tweezed them until only a faint shadow remained. This wasn't because they hated expression. It's because eyebrows were seen as distracting, even vulgar. A woman's face was supposed to be a clean slate, like a holy relic or a statue. Emotions were messy. Emotions made you human, and being human was kind of frowned upon. And here's a weird one. Some women didn't just stop at hair removal, they actually dyed their scalp and the remaining fringe of hair around the forehead to make the skin look even whiter by contrast. Imagine applying a layer of white chalk or powdered bone dust just above your eyebrows, so the whole face glowed with unnatural paleness. It wasn't flattering, it wasn't realistic, it was expected. Of course, none of this was painless. Infection was common, the tools were primitive, the hygiene questionable, and any slip of the hand could mean an open wound or raw skin. And don't even think about taking a break from this routine. Let your hairline creep forward even a little and the whispers start. Is she getting lazy? Has she lost her virtue? Maybe she's poor, maybe worse. Now, not everyone bought into this madness. In some corners of medieval Europe, especially rural areas, women gave this trend a hard pass. They had more pressing concerns, like not freezing to death or dying in childbirth. But among the nobility, in courts from Paris to London, this was the standard. Beauty wasn't just visual, it was a social contract. Break it, and you risk losing your marriage prospects, your reputation, even your inheritance. Historians still argue about just how widespread this forehead obsession was. Some say it was limited to fashion-obsessed courts, others believe it trickled down into middle-class households, where women imitated the elite out of aspiration or desperation. The truth probably lies somewhere in the middle, like most things in history. But what's undeniable is that the high forehead became a kind of cultural shorthand for femininity, virtue, and aristocratic grace. It's unsettling, really. In a world where women had so few choices, controlling your appearance became one of the only ways to assert identity. But even that choice was a trap. You weren't choosing how to look, you were choosing how to suffer. So you lean forward in your candlelit mirror, skin burning from the vinegar, and your scalp red from plucking. Your hairline is high enough now to pass inspection, and your eyebrows are barely visible. You look serene, silent, unreadable, and honestly kind of haunted. Okay, so your skin is sufficiently pale? Great. You've managed to look like a walking manuscript illustration of a ghost. But now it's time to tackle something even weirder. Your forehead. Yes, your forehead. Because in the Middle Ages, the higher it was, the hotter you were. And if you think today's contouring routines are extreme, get ready. Because now you're plucking back your hairline, literally, with tweezers, one hair at a time. This isn't a joke. The ideal medieval woman had a forehead that stretched halfway to her scalp. It was seen as a sign of intelligence, nobility, and spiritual purity. And to get that look, women plucked, shaved, or even rubbed their skin raw with walnut oil, or bandages soaked in vinegar to make the hair fall out. Eyebrows, gone, baby hairs, exiled. Sometimes they even shaved the top of their head back an inch or two, just to push that hairline even further. Think of it as the original five-head, and it was goals. The idea behind this forehead fetish is still debated by historians. Was it rooted in actual beauty ideals, or did it stem from religious iconography? Many depictions of the Virgin Mary showed her with a high, smooth forehead. No surprise, considering the church controlled most of art and culture. So women were expected to model themselves quite literally after the divine. A smooth, expressionless brow symbolized a calm, controlled nature. You weren't supposed to look emotional, you were supposed to look serene. Now imagine the daily maintenance. You sit by the hearth in the dim light of early morning, tweezers in hand, yanking out strands of hair while trying not to cry. Because if you cry, your skin gets puffy, and then you'll have to smear crushed rose petals under your eyes to reduce swelling. Beauty, in this world, is a job, and you don't get days off. There's a wonderfully strange case from medieval France involving a noblewoman named Isabeau of Bavaria. According to legend, and okay, maybe some dramatised accounts, she plucked her hairline so aggressively that it permanently damaged the follicles on her scalp. For years afterward, she wore elaborate headdresses to hide the irregular patches. These headpieces got so big and heavy that they eventually caused neck problems. And no, they didn't have chiropractors back then, just prayer. Speaking of headgear, the high forehead wasn't working alone. It came packaged with elaborate wimples, hennins and snoods, all of which helped frame and emphasise the forehead. The hennin, that cone-shaped princess hat you've seen in fairy tales, was often worn tilted back so the forehead was front and centre. Bonus points if your forehead was visibly veiny. That meant your skin was thin and delicate, like parchment, and everyone loved parchment. What's particularly funny and kind of awful is that even if you didn't have the right kind of forehead, you still had to pretend. Portrait artists would draw your face elongated and your brow exaggerated, whether you liked it or not. In fact, some modern historians now suspect that many of those ideal proportions in medieval portraits weren't real at all. They were edited, the way Instagram filters smooth out your features today. The more things change, right? Events. No one wanted to be that woman at court, the one with the pretty face and dragon breath. Now here's where it gets stranger. In some medieval courts, there was an unspoken code about when a woman could show her teeth. A smile was allowed, but only the faintest, tightest version. Something Mona Lisa level. No open laughter. That would reveal too much. Plus, joy wasn't considered especially feminine. You were supposed to look ethereal, slightly sad, like you were waiting for your husband to return from war, or for God to call you home. Anything more enthusiastic than that risked being seen as inappropriate. There's even a fringe theory among historians, definitely debated, that upper-class women were sometimes trained to suppress laughter. The idea being that joy made the face contort, which could reveal teeth, deepen smile lines, or ruin the delicate balance of their powdered skin. Whether this was a formal instruction or just a result of relentless social pressure, we may never know. But the concept of facial restraint was very real. Beauty wasn't just about how you looked, it was about how still you could remain. Let's pause and consider. Imagine being a teenager in this world. Your friends are all trying to figure out how to make their teeth smaller and less noticeable. No braces, no whitening strips, just prayers and pumice. If you were born with crooked or large teeth, tough luck. You might be laughed at, avoided, or quietly pitied. Some wealthier families even went so far as to remove visible molars to make their daughters' mouths look smaller. The pain, the risk of infection, worth it apparently for the chance of a good marriage. It wasn't all hopeless though. Some medieval beauty manuals, rare ones tucked away in monastic libraries, offered gentle remedies for whitening teeth and freshening breath without completely destroying your mouth. One such manuscript recommends rubbing sage leaves on the teeth and drinking wine infused with mint. Honestly, that's one of the more reasonable tips we've heard so far, and yet it's the quiet cruelty that lingers. The idea that you must silence your body to be seen as good. You had to shrink everything, your voice, your mouth, your appetite. The smaller you appeared, literally and metaphorically, the more perfect you became. So here you are again, sitting in your chamber. You haven't smiled in hours. You chew fennel seeds between meals and scrape your teeth with crushed eggshells. You avoid laughing, even when something's funny. Because beauty in this time, it's not joy, it's discipline. And if your teeth are starting to hurt, don't worry, that just means it's working. Your forehead is now the envy of every noblewoman from London to Lubeck. You've sacrificed your eyebrows, your scalp, and probably your sanity, but you're finally achieving that prized look. A pale, expressionless canvas ready to be admired and judged. But don't think you can relax just yet. Tonight, we descend further into the mouth of madness. We're talking teeth. Tiny, discreet, impossibly delicate teeth that never show, never smile too widely, and absolutely must not look like you've ever eaten anything harder than a grape. In medieval beauty lore, the mouth was a contradiction. It had to be there, obviously, but it shouldn't do much. No loud laughing, no toothy grins, No yelling across the courtyard because your goat got loose again. Lips were meant to stay closed, demure, mysterious. And teeth? The smaller the better. Ideally, your teeth were white, small, evenly spaced, and invisible 90% of the time. If someone actually saw your teeth, you were doing femininity wrong. This standard was rooted in more than just aesthetic taste. It had moral implications. A small closed mouth was considered a sign of modesty and self-control. Large teeth, or a wide mouth by contrast, were associated with gluttony, vulgarity, and sometimes even sexual promiscuity. Women with big mouths were seen as loud, opinionated, or worst of all, unladylike. The goal was to seem like you barely existed, just a soft breeze of a person with delicate bone structure and no opinions. Fun times. There's a fascinating passage in a 14th century French romance where the male hero praises the heroine's beauty by saying her teeth are so fine and small they would not break the skin of a grape. Romantic, right? Unless you're eating steak. Then, you're doomed. It's hard to chew nobly when your teeth are functionally ornamental. But medieval oral hygiene? Yeah, that was another nightmare altogether. They didn't exactly have Colgate. People used a mix of herbs, vinegar, salt, and even burnt rosemary ash to scrub their teeth, assuming they even bothered. Most commoners didn't. Among the elite it was a little more common, but the focus was more on appearance than health. So while you might rub your gums raw trying to whiten your teeth, the idea of actually preventing tooth decay? That wasn't the priority. Which leads us to one of the more ironic tragedies of the period. The women who tried the hardest to maintain their teeth often did the most damage. There are records of women using ground coral and brick dust to polish their enamel. Yes, brick dust. It looked good, until their enamel was completely gone and their teeth began crumbling in their gums. The ultimate in medieval beauty. Small, pearly teeth that eventually rotted out of your skull, but at least you looked pious doing it. Then there was the matter of breath. You couldn't show off your tiny, perfect teeth with breath that smelled like boiled eel and sadness. So, medieval women chewed herbs, often parsley, mint, or cloves. Some also used rosewater mouth rinses, which didn't do much medically but at least covered up the evidence of a questionable diet. In some parts of Italy, women were known to chew fennel seeds and even sprinkle ground cinnamon into their mouths before social. You're pale, hollowed, hairless in all the wrong places, and your mouth is small enough to pass medieval inspection. At this point you should be golden, right? But no, because now comes the part that ties it all together. Being thin. Not just thin, but fragile, ethereal, one skipped meal away from sainthood. Because in the Middle Ages, looking like you hadn't eaten in days wasn't just fashionable, it was holy. Fasting wasn't just for monks and mystics. Among noble women, not eating became a badge of both spiritual devotion and social superiority. The thinner you were, the more virtuous you were assumed to be. A woman with a full figure might be considered healthy, sure, but she was also suspected of indulgence, gluttony, or even moral weakness. The ideal body was soft but slight, delicate but shapely, like a sculpture that might break if you breathed too hard on it. This wasn't some quiet internal practice either. In many aristocratic courts, fasting was flaunted. Women would attend feasts but barely touch the food, delicately sipping wine or picking at a piece of bread with exaggerated grace. It wasn't just about health, it was about power. Denying yourself pleasure, especially in public, sent a message. I am in control. I am closer to God. I am better than you. Now, let's talk about St. Catherine of Siena. She's probably one of the most famous examples of religious fasting in the medieval era. Catherine claimed to survive for years on nothing but the Eucharist, literally a piece of communion bread. Some historians today believe she may have suffered from a condition now recognised as anorexia, though obviously no one called it that back then. Her starvation was interpreted as divine devotion. She was canonised, and her image, gaunt, sunken, glowing, became part of the beauty and spiritual ideal for women for centuries. And here's where it gets even murkier. Spiritual purity and physical appearance weren't just connected, they were indistinguishable. A woman who was naturally thin and pale could be seen as blessed, maybe even saint-like. A woman who had to work at it through starvation, herbs that induced vomiting, or long nights of self-flagellation, was still admired, but with a different flavour of reverence. She was admired for her suffering. There are quirky tidbits too, like the popularity of something called holy anorexia. It wasn't a medical term, obviously, but a spiritual label applied to women who fasted to the point of hallucination and ecstasy. Some noble families even encourage this behaviour in their daughters, seeing it as a shortcut to sainthood, or at least a way to increase the family's religious prestige. That's right. Starving your child could be a career move. And don't get the wrong idea, men were doing similar things, especially in monasteries, but it hit women differently. Fasting became not just a religious act, but a gendered performance. You weren't just purging your body of sin. You were proving that you were too holy for hunger, too pure for earthly needs. Your body wasn't yours anymore. It was a shrine. But let's rewind to the daily grind of it. Imagine waking up in your cold stone chamber with a roaring fire that doesn't actually do much. Your maidservant brings in your breakfast, a stale crust of rye and a cup of goat's milk. But you wave it away. You're fasting, which really just means keeping up appearances. Your head aches, your limbs are weak, but you smile, faintly, and go about your day. You faint during morning prayers. Everyone pretends not to notice. Among your circle of noblewomen, there's an unspoken competition. Who can eat the least? Who can go the longest between meals? Who can survive on herbs and broth and still stand upright at Mass? It's brutal. It's isolating. It's revered. Even the fashion of the time reinforced this. Gowns were tight around the ribcage and torso, emphasising a narrow waist. Lacing was used to cinch the body, not yet full corsetry, but an early form of it. Some gowns had no stretch and could barely accommodate a full breath, let alone a meal. The silhouette of the day was long, narrow, almost reed-like. Rounded curves were okay. Hips and busts had their place, but the stomach had to be flat, the ribs discreet. Your whole frame was supposed to say, "I exist on air and prayer." Scholars still argue about how far these standards actually reached. Were all noblewomen really starving themselves? Or were the ideals exaggerated by male poets, clerics, and artists projecting their fantasies onto female bodies? There's definitely truth to that. A lot of what we know comes from second-hand sources, men writing about women, artists painting exaggerated saints, religious leaders praising devotion while quietly destroying lives. But the physical evidence, where it exists, corseted bones, letters, manuscripts, suggest that many women lived these expectations day after day. There were also class divisions, of course. Peasant women couldn't afford to fast, nor would anyone expect them to. They needed energy to survive their lives, fieldwork, childbirth, constant labour. But the higher up the social ladder you climbed, the more your plate had to stay empty. The irony? The rich had access to food, and were praised for pretending they didn't want it. And just to drive it home, here's a weird little fact. Some women would chew food and then discreetly spit it into napkins to avoid digestion. That's right, pre-digestion food rejection. A casual, court-approved eating disorder centuries before anyone had a name for it. So now, here you are again. It's dinner time in your candlelit hall. Your lord is eating roast pheasant, a smell so rich it makes your stomach twist. You sip watered wine and pretend to be indifferent. Your gown is tight across your ribs. You haven't eaten a full meal in days, but everyone praises your lightness and your grace. You feel dizzy, and someone leans over and says, "You look radiant tonight." You manage a faint smile. You're starving, but that's the point. You've stopped eating, you've erased your eyebrows, and you've shrunk your mouth into a delicate, well-mannered smirk. But you're not quite finished, because now it's time to talk about the final, and arguably most unachievable layer of medieval beauty, purity. Not just physical purity, but the big one, the one that loomed over every girl from the moment she could walk in a straight line, virginity. And not the real-life kind either. We're talking about a fantasy version of chastity, spun together with threads of religious dogma, courtly love poetry, and more than a little wishful thinking. This is the virgin ideal. In the Middle Ages, a beautiful woman wasn't just physically appealing, she had to look and act like she had never even heard of sex. And if she was married? Well, ideally she still seemed virginal. The standard was ridiculous, ethereal and untouchable, graceful but completely innocent, mysterious but also morally transparent. Basically, you were expected to be a walking contradiction in a really expensive dress. It all stemmed, of course, from the religious climate. The Virgin Mary was the ultimate role model. She was seen as the perfect woman, kind, obedient, selfless, and eternally untouched. Artists and poets bent over backward to make her the centerpiece of womanhood. That meant real women, living, breathing, complex women, were expected to mould themselves into that impossible shape. Pale, passive, and pure. Let's put you in the mindset. You're 13, maybe 14, old enough for marriage negotiations to begin. Your mother has already warned you to walk modestly, avoid eye contact with men, and never speak above a whisper unless addressed directly. You've been taught how to sit with your ankles crossed, how to lower your eyes demurely, and how to say no, with just the right amount of angelic confusion. You've also been warned that even looking too interested in something, anything, might make people think you're impure. Passion, after all, was suspicious. Even your clothing reflects this bizarre blend of innocence and allure. Your dress might be modest in cut, but made from expensive fabrics that whisper privilege. You might wear a veil over your hair, not just for fashion, but because visible hair was associated with temptation. The more covered you were, the more good you appeared. Modesty wasn't just suggested, it was legally enforced in some regions, literally. In parts of medieval Italy, laws dictated how much skin unmarried women could show. Yes, they had purity police. There's this fascinating story about Agnes of Rome, a 12-year-old girl canonised for refusing to marry and protecting her chastity to the death. Her legend became a popular tale for young women, taught as a lesson in devotion and moral superiority. In art, she's often shown with a lamb, symbol of innocence, and a face so expressionless you'd think she'd been mildly sedated. This, apparently, was the vibe everyone was supposed to emulate. Pure, passive, silent. And here's the kicker. Even your physical features were supposed to reflect your purity. Small nose, delicate and modest. Large eyes? Great, as long as they didn't sparkle with too much curiosity. High, smooth forehead. Of course, because nothing says virgin like an enormous, blank canvas above your brows. Medieval writers described beautiful women with skin whiter than milk, hair like gold threads, and voices so soft they could not disturb a bird. That last one sounds poetic until you realise it basically means you shouldn't speak above a whisper. Ever. But let's talk about hair for a second. In medieval symbolism, hair was a loaded gun. Loose hair on a woman was associated with seduction, danger, and lack of control. This is why brides wore their hair down only on their wedding day, symbolising both virginity and transition. After that, it was covered or braided tightly, because leaving it loose would be like walking around with a neon sign flashing might be a temptress. The rules were unspoken, but rigid. You didn't want to be mistaken for a loose woman, because the consequences were brutal. Speaking of which, the stakes for falling short of this ideal weren't just social, they were physical. A woman suspected of sexual impurity could be shamed, disinherited, exiled, even killed. It didn't take much. A rumour, a jealous suitor, an unfortunately timed encounter in a garden. For noble families, daughters were political currency. If a girl's virginity came into question, it could sink entire marriage alliances. So yes, the pressure was real, and yes, it was constant. There's a strange scholarly debate about whether these purity standards actually affected women's day-to-day lives, or if they were just idealised projections from male-dominated literature and religious doctrine. On one hand, poetry from the era is overflowing with references to untouched maidens and flawless beauties. On the other, real women sometimes found ways to work the system. Some used their virgin reputations as bargaining chips. Others faked virginity with herbs and clever storytelling. A few even went full holy maiden and joined convents to escape the whole marriage mess entirely. A quirky historical tidbit. In some regions, midwives were trained to restore virginity through minor surgeries or herbal treatments, basically the medieval version of a hymenoplasty. It wasn't common, but it happened. Reputation was everything, and people would go to extraordinary lengths to protect it. And yet, despite all these impossible expectations, women still laughed, gossiped, flirted, even loved. They wrote poems, traded secrets, and found moments of rebellion. But they did so behind veils, under layers of fabric, and always with one eye over their shoulder. Because in the medieval world, being seen as impure wasn't just a gossip risk. It could destroy your life. So here you are, sitting in the garden under the careful gaze of your chaperone. You speak softly, hands folded, eyes lowered. You're 13, but you already know the script by heart. You must be beautiful, yes, but not too much. Innocent, but not naive. Seen, but not heard. You hear a giggle from behind the hedge, some other girl, less careful than you, maybe whispering with a page boy. You tense, not because you're jealous, because you know how quickly that kind of thing becomes a story, and in this world, a single story can become your legacy. So you've nailed the holy trifecta: pale, quiet, and virginal. But something's missing. Your hair, your literal crown, isn't just dangling there by accident. No, in the medieval world, your hair colour could make or break your entire existence. And if you were truly aiming for elite beauty status, only one colour would do: blonde. Not honey blonde, not brassy yellow. We're talking luminous, sun-kissed strands of spun gold, preferably glowing like a holy halo under candlelight. And if you weren't born with it, too bad. You'd just have to fake it, even if it meant burning your scalp with homemade bleach. This obsession with golden hair didn't come out of nowhere. In medieval Europe, blonde was shorthand for purity, youth, and heavenly grace. Artists painted angels and saints with flowing blonde locks, even if they were depicting women from regions where blonde hair wasn't exactly genetically common. The symbolism ran deep. Blonde meant divine, blonde meant delicate, blonde meant you'd probably die young, and wasn't that just lovely? For brunettes and redheads, this was a problem, so women got to work with a variety of horrifying DIY treatments to lighten their hair. One method involved soaking your hair in a concoction of lye, alum, and stale urine. Yes, urine, before sitting in the sun for hours. It didn't always work, but when it did, you'd end up with dried out straw-like blonde strands and likely chemical burns. Beauty win? Maybe. Nerve damage? Possibly. One particularly infamous beauty recipe comes from a 15th century Italian manuscript, instructing women to mix saffron, lemon juice, and goat's urine, apply it to the hair, and then sit outside with a wide-brimmed hat that had the top cut out. So just your hair would roast in the sun. The goal? Lift the pigment? The result? Sometimes it worked, but usually it just fried your hair into a crispy halo of medieval regret. And don't think you could just wear a wig. Wigs were rare, and seen as theatrical or deceptive, plus extremely hot and itchy under layers of wimples and veils. Some women used thin veils dyed with golden hues to give the illusion of blonde hair peeking through, but it was no substitute for the real thing. You wanted the shine, the shimmer, the approval of everyone from your priest to your suitor, and if it cost you your scalp, so be it. A historical example. Let's talk about Lucrezia Borgia. While she lived slightly post-medieval in the early Renaissance, her golden hair was so famous that it was sent as a diplomatic gift. Literally. Strands of her hair were preserved in jewellery and letters as tokens of power and allure. Whether it was her natural colour or achieved through early bleach jobs is up for debate. But the point is clear. Golden hair meant influence. It turned women into legends, or at least well-married nobles. Of course, this aesthetic ideal excluded whole populations. Dark-haired women, especially those from southern Europe or the Middle East, were often portrayed as seductive, dangerous, or morally ambiguous. In medieval poetry, a dark-haired temptress usually spelled trouble for the hero, while the golden-haired maiden was the one he'd take home to his castle. The racial and cultural undertones here are loud. Blonde wasn't just beautiful, it was seen as better. Now here's where it gets interesting. While the church pushed for modesty and chastity, the romantic literature of the time, courtly love tales, troubadour poetry, fueled the obsession with blonde hair even more. In these stories, the perfect lady was always golden-haired, gentle, and mysteriously sad. Men fell to their knees for her, sang ballads under her window, or died in duels defending her honour. Blonde hair became the symbol not just of holiness, but of high drama. So, naturally, women copied the ideal, even if they knew it was fiction, even if they knew it was dangerous. There's a documented case in 14th century England of a noblewoman who went blind after accidentally getting bleach in her eyes during a hair lightening session. Her servants testified that she'd been trying to match the golden shade of a lady in a painting, art imitating life, or life imitating art with a side of permanent eye damage. But the consequences weren't always so visible. Repeated chemical treatments led to hair loss, infections, and open sores on the scalp. And let's not forget the smell. Many of these bleaching agents, especially urine-based ones, left women smelling like a farm animal in high summer. You'd walk into court looking like Aphrodite but reeking like the stables. The things people did for beauty. And still, it wasn't just about hair colour. It was about what that colour represented. You weren't just bleaching your hair, you were bleaching your entire identity. You were aligning yourself with a mythic version of womanhood, one that was unattainable for most and deadly for some. Blonde was a shortcut to grace, to love, to heaven. And it wasn't fair, but then nothing about medieval beauty was. Historians still argue over how much pressure women actually felt to conform to these blonde ideals. Some scholars say it was mostly limited to elite courts and aristocratic circles, where women had both the time and the resources to ruin their hair for fashion. Others argue that the obsession trickled down into the merchant and middle classes, especially in cities like Venice and Florence, where visual culture was booming and appearance meant opportunity. There's even evidence that men played into this too, not with hair colour, but by writing endless odes to sun-haired maidens and golden angels. The poetic imagery set the bar and women were expected to meet it. Never mind genetics, never mind chemistry, just bleach, pray, and roast in the sun like a delicate glowing meatball. So now, back in your chamber, you sit by the window with your scalp still stinging. You've followed the recipe from that whispered beauty manual. The sun beats down through the open circle in your straw hat. Your hair steams. You smell faintly of lemons and livestock. A servant fans you lazily. You feel lightheaded, but maybe that's just the fumes. Later at court, someone glances your way. Your hair catches the candlelight. It shimmers. For a moment you think, maybe this was worth it. Then someone else turns to look, and another. You smile faintly, and tell yourself not to scratch your head, because it still really, really burns. At this point you've probably figured out that medieval beauty was less about being alive and more about looking like you were slowly fading out of existence. But don't think for a second that this obsession with delicate looks meant people actually smelled delicate. Welcome to the rank underbelly of medieval beauty culture, where baths were rare, sweat was constant, and your nose was the unsung hero trying to get you through each day without fainting. First off, no, medieval people weren't completely allergic to washing. They bathed more than the myths suggest, when they could. But for noble women, hygiene wasn't always about health, it was about optics. You were supposed to smell fresh and floral, yes, but without getting wet. Actual bathing was seen as potentially dangerous to the soul, or even harmful to fertility. Plus, medical experts of the time claimed that hot water opened your pores, making you more vulnerable to disease, sin, or both. Because nothing screams medical knowledge, like blaming your bathtub for a plague outbreak. So what did women do instead of bathing? They perfumed. A lot. They doused themselves in rose water, lavender oils, crushed violets, and even spiced vinegar. Some stuffed their undergarments with dried herbs like mint, marjoram and thyme, basically turning their corsets into medieval potpourri satchels. Linen chemises and veils were also frequently laundered, more so than the body itself, in a constant attempt to trick people into thinking cleanliness was happening. And then came the masks. No, not COVID style, but scent masks. Perfumed gloves, pomanders, small perforated balls filled with aromatic resins, and even garlands worn around the neck or pinned inside dresses. These weren't just decorative, they were olfactory armour. The upper classes understood that things stank. The key was to stink better. Let's talk about hair, since we just tortured it in the last section. If you thought scalp care was a modern obsession, think again. Medieval women often went weeks without washing their hair, instead rubbing it with scented oils to mask the natural build-up. Rosemary, clove oil and bay leaves were popular choices, not for cleanliness, but to convince people your head hadn't turned into a small ecosystem. One quirky tip from a 14th century beauty manual recommends boiling rosemary in wine and using the mixture to rinse the hair and cheer the brain. Sounds nice, until you remember how often lice made themselves at home in those braids and veils. Delousing was a constant itchy battle. Women used special combs, vinegar rinses and prayers. Lots of prayers. Now, not everyone could afford the luxury of smell-masking oils and herbs. For poorer women, especially in the cities, public bathhouses were a more realistic option, until the church decided they were too sinful. Because apparently bathing in the same room as other people was a gateway drug to lust, disease and moral collapse. Many bathhouses were shut down or heavily regulated, and women were expected to wash modestly at home using a basin, a cloth, and whatever level of shame they could muster. But here's where things get contradictory. Again, the same society that scolded women for washing too much also expected them to look and smell immaculate. Not just passably clean, but spiritually fragrant. Writers of the time would describe their ideal women as smelling like lilies, honey, or spring rain. Never sweat, never food, never, God forbid, reality. And of course, the pressure to smell right wasn't evenly distributed. Noble women were held to impossible standards. You were expected to sit through hours of court, layers of heavy clothing, stuffy rooms, and still somehow radiate the scent of divine approval. One wrong whiff, and suddenly the gossip started. She's been riding too much, someone might whisper. Or worse, she's not what she pretends to be. One historical figure worth mentioning here is Isolde of Brittany, the often overlooked foil to the famous Isolde in the Tristan legend. She was praised not just for her golden hair and pale skin, but for smelling like flowers even after travel. Whether that was a poetic metaphor or just the result of an extreme perfume habit, we'll never know. But the idea stuck. The perfect woman didn't just look good, she smelled like a meadow in May. Of course, there's a scholarly debate around how seriously we should take all this. Some historians argue that medieval people were far more pragmatic than the surviving beauty manuals suggest. That maybe the pressure to stay fragrant wasn't quite so dramatic. Others point to court documents, letters, and poems that obsess over scent as evidence that yes, this was a big deal, and when you consider how rare bathing was, it starts to make sense. In a world full of natural funk, smelling even slightly better than average could be a social power move. There's even an awkward fringe theory that certain religious relics, like the bodies of saints that supposedly smelled sweet after death, were exaggerated to support this scent-based beauty obsession. If even dead holy women were supposed to smell like roses, what hope did a sweaty, sun-drenched noblewoman have? So, it's morning again. You're standing near the hearth, rubbing lavender-scented oil on your wrists. A maid combs your unwashed hair, carefully pulling out whatever decided to move in overnight. You dab rosewater on your neck, tuck a sachet of mint into your bodice, and inhale deeply. You don't feel clean, not really, but you smell acceptable. Maybe even good. Later in court, a knight passes close by and pauses. He leans in. "You smell," he says softly, "like the first day of spring." You smile faintly. You're sweating under your layers, your scalp itches, and you haven't had a real bath in weeks, but no one has to know. Let's say the lavender oil didn't quite do the trick, and your natural medieval musk is getting ambitious. No worries, because this is where you reach into your little wooden cosmetics chest and pull out the really serious stuff, your skin cream. And by cream, we mean a bubbling cauldron of ingredients so toxic, even your local apothecary raises an eyebrow. Tonight, you're diving into the glamorous and horrifying world of medieval makeup, where lead, mercury, arsenic, and vinegar were casually mixed into something you smeared directly onto your face. Let's start with ceruse. Sounds elegant, doesn't it? Like some French artisanal paste sold in a boutique. In reality, ceruse was a thick white paint made from vinegar and white lead, aged in clay pots until it congealed into a smooth, deadly cream. Women used it to achieve that perfect, no blood circulating here look. Ceruse covered freckles, blotches, and the overall stress of surviving in a world with no antibiotics or civil rights. It made you look angelic. It also made your skin peel off in strips if you wore it too often. One documented case involved a noblewoman in England who used ceruse daily to maintain her famously pale complexion. Eventually her skin became so raw and damaged that she had to have her maid apply it for her, avoiding open wounds. Did she stop using it? No, of course not. Beauty standards wait for no one. She simply upped the dosage to mask the damage caused by the product itself. A vicious loop centuries before Instagram filters, and lead wasn't the only villain. Mercury too had its moment in the spotlight. It was found in spot removers designed to fade blemishes, age spots, or any sign of sun damage. The cream was applied at night, often while wearing a mask or wrapping your face in cloth so the product could work its magic. Magic here meaning nerve damage, tremors, hallucinations, and eventual organ failure. But hey, anything to get rid of that one freckle that keeps showing up when the light hits just wrong. Now, you're probably wondering, did everyone use this stuff? Number Cirrus and mercury-based creams were mostly used by the elite, because they were expensive and difficult to make. But where nobles led, others followed. Merchant-class women copied the look with watered-down versions, chalk and flour pastes or ground-up alabaster mixed with egg whites. None of it was skin-friendly. All of it got into your pores and probably shortened your life by a few years. What's fascinating and disturbing is how deeply these concoctions were linked to morality. Smooth white skin was more than just pretty. It symbolised virtue, wealth, and a soul untouched by worldly sin. Women who had scars, moles, or tanned skin were seen as morally suspect. There was even a belief that beauty on the outside reflected beauty on the inside. A clean white face meant a clean white soul. It's the original good vibes only aesthetic, except enforced with death paste. But wait, it gets worse. If your skin started to show the side effects of the poison you were rubbing on it daily, you'd be expected to hide that too. Blistering? Try a blend of rose water and crushed pearls. Skin turning grey? That's when you pull out the rouge, a toxic red dye made from cinnabar, aka mercury sulfide. That's right. To hide the effects of one poison, you applied another. Eventually your whole routine was just chemical warfare happening in slow motion across your face. There's a weirdly charming footnote to all of this. Some women, particularly those in remote or rural areas, opted for homemade masks made from bread dough, honey, or even snail slime. Yes, snails. People believed that snail mucus could rejuvenate the skin. It sounds outlandish, but fun fact, snail mucin is now in high-end Korean skincare. So hey, the medieval ladies may have gotten that one accidentally right. Still, that was the exception. For most, beauty was a ritual of slow decay. You'd wake up, scrub your face with vinegar and salt, apply lead-based paint, dab your cheeks with something red and questionable, powder it down with rice flour, and then pray it stayed on through mass and midday gossip. By evening, your face felt like a dry lake bed, cracking with each blink, each smile, each whispered comment about whose cousin was secretly in love with a monk. And of course, the cycle never stopped. The second you washed it off, your real skin looked worse, more sallow, more irritated, more human. You had no choice but to start again the next day, and the day after that, until your skin no longer had anything left to give. Scholars still argue whether these cosmetics were used primarily for beauty, or as a form of social control. Some believe the emphasis on paleness and perfection was a way to reinforce the power structure, nobles above peasants, women above no one. Others think women used cosmetics to reclaim a sliver of control in a world that offered them very little. By painting your face, you shaped your own myth, even if the myth was slowly killing you. And then there's the question of how men fit into all this. Noblemen didn't usually wear makeup unless they were actors or very, very French, but they were often the ones praising, critiquing, and setting the standard for what women should look like. Artists painted impossibly smooth-faced ladies. Poets sang about women with porcelain skin and berry-red lips. Clerics wrote moral treatises about how vanity was evil, unless it was beautiful. Hypocrisy, as always, was well dressed. So now, back in your room, you open your small wooden box. Inside, your Cerus, your powdered cinnabar, your chalk, your oils. You look in the mirror, your skin is blotchy, your cheeks raw. You dab, you blend, you smooth. You create the illusion of health, virtue, perfection. Later, as you walk through the hall, someone comments, "Your skin is like ivory." You smile, and try not to think about how, by 35, your teeth might fall out and your bones could start to ache for reasons no one understands yet. But tonight, you're glowing. You are ready to make everyone in court assume you are just too delicate to exist in this cruel, cruel world. This ideal wasn't just about looking unwell. It was about hinting at something deeper. A woman who looked physically weak was often assumed to be emotionally sensitive, artistically inclined, and spiritually advanced. Men wrote poems about their lovers as fading roses, melting snow, and ghostly maidens. You weren't supposed to be of this world. You were supposed to look like you were barely tolerating it. Now here's the creepy twist. The beauty of the sickly look blurred the line between life and death. It wasn't uncommon for women to be compared to corpses in love poems. She lay still as marble, one poet wrote, her breath so light it stirred not the air. Romantic, right? Also mildly terrifying. But this was the mood. You didn't just want to look passive, you wanted to look perishable. A perfect example of this can be found in the court of Burgundy, where pale skin and sorrowful expressions became something of a competitive sport. Ladies would faint during church services, swoon during dances, and recover just in time to offer a small, trembling smile. One noblewoman reportedly claimed to drink only rosewater for an entire week before a royal banquet, so her skin would appear bloodless and divine. She didn't eat, she barely moved. She made a huge impression. Scholars still debate how much of this was conscious performance versus actual illness. After all, medieval Europe was crawling with diseases, and nutrition wasn't exactly balanced. A lot of women were genuinely unwell. But instead of worrying about that, society just aestheticized it. The line between sick and stylish blurred to the point where real health problems became a kind of fashion accessory. And if you think this trend faded with time, think again. The idealization of the suffering woman persisted well into the Renaissance, the Romantic period, and yes, even modern pop culture. There's something disturbingly timeless about a culture that praises a woman most when she's silent, fragile, and barely hanging on. Back in your candlelit chamber, you examine your face in the polished bronze mirror. You've applied your white powder, a touch of crushed berries beneath your eyes, and your lips are tinted just enough to suggest you might have coughed blood recently. Tastefully, of course. You lie back on your velvet daybed, draping an arm over your forehead with soft theatrical flair. Later, in the great hall, someone leans over and whispers, "You look so delicate tonight, almost like you're not really here." You smile faintly. That's exactly the look you were going for. You're glowing, all right, but it's less the glow of health and more the faint shimmer of chemical exposure. Still, in the flickering torchlight of the great hall, no one sees the damage under the layers. They see the alabaster skin, the veiled golden hair, the modest smile. You've perfected the mask. But tonight, we're going to talk about a trend that took all this delicate dying swan beauty and gave it a proper gothic twist. Because for a while, looking sick wasn't just fashionable, it was practically divine. Welcome to the age of the sickly look, when everyone wanted to appear one fainting spell away from sainthood. This wasn't some isolated aesthetic. It was woven through every painting, poem, and whispered rumour at court. Women were praised for looking pale to the point of translucent. Hollow cheeks, dark shadows under the eyes, even a slight bluish tint to the lips. These were beauty markers. It wasn't about radiance. It was about fragility. The goal was to appear physically delicate and emotionally subdued, as if the weight of the world, or, your own corset, was just too much. The link between beauty and sickness wasn't new. In medieval Christian thought, suffering had redemptive value. Saints were beautiful in their affliction. Women who bore pain with grace were seen as spiritually elevated. So when you looked like you might swoon at any moment, it wasn't cause for alarm, it was cause for admiration. People assumed you were closer to God, more refined, more well-bred. It wasn't just a spiritual flex. There was a fashionable side to this too. The ideal courtly woman had thin wrists and ankles, pale fingers, a swan-like neck and a spine that suggested you spent most of your day reclining dramatically on a cushioned bench. If you had a cough, even better. A little consumptive glow gave your cheeks a gentle flush and your lips a tragic hue. You looked like the heroine of a doomed romance, a medieval prequel to the Victorian tuberculosis chic. Let's talk fashion for a second. The gowns of this era were perfectly designed to exaggerate the fragile silhouette. Long draping sleeves and tight bodices made your arms look narrower and your waist smaller. Gowns were often cinched just under the bust, creating the illusion of height and delicacy. If your head looked a little too heavy for your body, that was ideal. You weren't supposed to look strong. You were supposed to look ornamental. Of course, you couldn't rely on clothing alone to pull off the sickly chic look. Makeup helped, especially lead-based powders that made your skin unnaturally white and powdery. But some women went a step further, using berries or beetroot to gently darken the under-eye area. That's right. They created the illusion of eye bags on purpose. Anything that made you look more tragic, more wan, more romantic was fair game. One particularly dramatic beauty trick involved gently pressing a cold spoon under the eyes to encourage slight swelling and bruising. The result? A soft, puffy under-eye shadow that whispered, "I haven't slept in days, and I've been weeping about my lover who died in the Crusades." Combine that with a fluttering fan and a strategically placed lace handkerchief, and by now you've mastered the look. Thin enough to look holy, pale enough to appear freshly embalmed and perfumed to the point of distraction. But just in case you thought this whole beauty circus was limited to women, allow me to direct your tired eyes to the young men of the medieval courts. No, they didn't get a free pass. Sure, they weren't bleaching their scalps with goat pee or smearing mercury under their eyes, but trust me, medieval masculinity came with its own punishing list of requirements. Tonight, let's talk about the impossible standards for men too. Because if you think your corset's tight, imagine trying to look brave, rich and holy while surviving hand-to-hand combat. Start with the basics, the medieval dreamboat. He's tall, but not so tall that he looks awkward. He's lean, but muscular, ideally a kind of wiry strength, like a sword with abs. His face? Sharp, clean-shaven, with a high forehead, yes, they plucked hairlines too, a straight nose and clear, unblemished skin. His hands? Delicate but calloused in just the right places. You wanted to look like you read poetry by candlelight but could still murder a guy before breakfast. So how did men keep their skin smooth and their features sharp in a world with no barbershops, no razors, and a medical system that thought sneezing too hard might summon demons? The answer, very carefully and often painfully. Upper-class young men used tweezers to shape their brows and remove stray facial hairs. That's right, medieval manscaping. Some even used vinegar-based tonics to cleanse their skin and avoid breakouts, since pimples were seen as signs of weak character or excessive lust. But beyond the face, a young nobleman's entire identity was wrapped up in his body, and what he did with it. From childhood, he was trained for war, sport, and the extremely formal art of looking cool on a horse. This wasn't about health or fitness the way we think of it now. It was about image. Knights and squires were judged by how they carried themselves in armour, how gracefully they moved during a dance, and how well they recited romantic poetry to a lady without tripping over their own tights. And yes, tights were very much a thing. In fact, men's fashion during the later Middle Ages was just as tight, restrictive, and oddly revealing as anything women wore. Men wore hose that outlined their legs and buttocks in excruciating detail. Codpieces became so exaggerated in some courts that laws were eventually passed to tone them down. A well-dressed man might spend just as long as his female counterpart getting ready, smoothing down his hair, adjusting his doublet, selecting his colours. Appearance was everything, and failure to look the part could ruin your chances of court success. One real historical figure who fit and broke these rules was Edward of Woodstock, better known as the Black Prince. He was the medieval poster boy for knightly perfection, skilled in battle, handsome, rich, well-dressed, and tragically doomed. His early portraits show a man with the classic look, strong nose, soft curls, and a fashion sense that screamed, "I'm ready for war, but also ready to pose for an oil painting." Later, illness ravaged him, and by the time he died young, he had morphed into exactly the kind of tragic male beauty medieval society adored, noble, broken, unreachable. But the pressure on men wasn't just aesthetic, it was deeply moral and deeply performative. You had to be brave, yes, but not too emotional, devout but not boring, courteous but ready to fight to the death at a moment's notice. Every glance, every bow, every word spoken at court had to walk a tightrope of masculinity so narrow it made women's standards look almost flexible by comparison. And of course, there were consequences. Men who couldn't meet these expectations were mocked, dismissed, or worse, accused of being effeminate. In some medieval courts, a man who dressed too elaborately or spoke too softly risked being labelled unmanly, a vague but dangerous insult that could threaten your social standing. In a society that prized hierarchy and conformity, not fitting the mould was risky business. There's even a fringe theory, still debated by historians, that the rise of courtly love poetry was as much about controlling men as it was about romanticising women. These poems painted male lovers as gentle, suffering, noble souls who worshipped their lady from afar. Sounds sweet until you realise it created an impossible role model. Real men were expected to act like fictional ones, chasing unattainable women while suppressing all the very human messiness underneath. You couldn't just be in love, you had to perform love, like it was an art form, and a test of character. Quirky side note. Some medieval men wore beauty patches, tiny silk spots stuck to the face to cover blemishes, or signal a certain fashion-forwardness. Yes, they stole that one from the ladies. A patch on the cheek might say, "I'm flirtatious." A patch near the eye, "I'm dangerous but poetic." And somewhere, some knight in full plate armour was carefully placing a silk sticker on his nose and praying it didn't fall off during the joust. Of course, not every man had the luxury to worry about aesthetics. Peasant men were too busy trying not to starve. But in the elite world of castles and courts, looks were capital. A young man's prospects could rise or fall on the curve of his cheekbone or the shine of his boots. And once again, beauty wasn't just about attraction. It was about moral worth. A clean face meant a clean soul. A well-groomed knight was a godlier knight. And if you bled out on a battlefield looking hot, even better. So here you are. Let's say you're a young lord this time. You've bathed, shaved, plucked, oiled, and laced yourself into hose so tight you're walking, like you've just dismounted a war horse. Your hair is curled, your collar is stiff, and your sword is mostly for show. You head to the great hall where ladies flutter fans and men pretend not to look exhausted. Someone claps you on the back and says, "Looking sharp today," like a painting come to life. You nod, smile slightly, say something poetic about the moon, then walk away, making sure your cloak billows behind you just right. Naturally, these clothes weren't breathable, so underneath all that finery you were sweating, constantly. And since you couldn't take off your gown in public, you just marinated in your own exhaustion. Your waist ached, your back cramped. You fanned yourself while pretending not to suffer, because suffering was part of the look. You weren't supposed to be comfortable. You were supposed to look transcendent. Of course, there were exceptions, and private noblewomen sometimes wore looser gowns, especially when pregnant or ill. But even then, the standards lingered. If guests came by unexpectedly, you'd better be ready to relace yourself and slap on a veil. Your body was a billboard, and every curve or wrinkle was up for interpretation. Now here's a quirky little detail. Some young girls were introduced to lacing as early as age 12. It wasn't always tight, at first, but over time, the laces got snugger, and the expectations grew heavier. The message was clear. Start early, learn to tolerate discomfort, and become one with your body cage. It's tradition. And scholars still argue over how damaging this was. Some believe early bodices weren't nearly as restrictive as Renaissance or Victorian corsets. Others point